One of the most anticipated limited series this year is FX's Mrs. America, which chronicles the bare-knuckled fight to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment into the United States Constitution. It's certain to be a big Emmy player this year, and we are joined with the creator of the program, Dahvi Waller. I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and Dahvi, the first thing I want to ask is, what drew you to tell this amazing story?
You know, I grew up in a house driven by politics. My dad is a political scientist. I always joke that election night was like a major sporting event in my family. It was like the World Series. So as a writer, I was looking to do a series set in the world of politics, and particularly centered on women, because all my favorite films and television shows were generally centered on male politicians, or if it was about a woman, she was the wife or she was a victim. So I was really drawn to the idea of Phyllis Schlafly because, one, it's very unexpected to tell the story of a social movement through the leader of the backlash. And two, she's a really complex character. I remember when I first started doing research into her, I learned that she was originally very interested, and her whole life actually really interested in a career in strategic defense and not women's issues. I thought, well, that's a question I want to answer. Like, why did she pivot? What did she hope to get out of it by pivoting to the Equal Rights Amendment? And then when I started reading about all the leaders of the women's movement, I just thought, these are some colorful characters that I want to write and live with for a couple of years.
And so, actually, piggybacking off of that, how did you manage to find the humanity in someone like Phyllis Schlafly? Because I'm sure a lot of people would think that is a very tough thing to do. They're not wrong. I try to approach every character that I write about from a position from compassion, and also a little bit, maybe it's because I'm a daughter of a therapist, but a little bit like a therapist, like trying to find where are the vulnerabilities, where are the motivations for their actions, where does this all come from? So, and I find that when you do that, you're able to find what is human in them, what is, where the insecurities are, where the fears are. I mean, I think there is a lot of fear going on, both within Phyllis Schlafly and all the housewives in her movement. And I have a lot of compassion for people who are afraid and who are afraid of change. I find there's something very human in that. So I try to focus on that rather than on just looking at their actions in a surface way. I'm curious, did you also use that approach when you were writing the scenes where Phyllis is dealing with her son, John?
Absolutely. There's very little written about her son, John, but we do know that he was outed in 1992. We do know that she had a homophobic rhetoric within her campaign always. And so I thought, what is it like to be both her son, and what is it like to be a mother who doesn't believe in gay rights, or who's anti-gay rights and constantly campaigning against gay rights? What is that like to discover that your own son is gay? So I just tried to imagine especially once I learned that John lived at home with his mother, I think into his 50s. So he was at home during his 20s, during the time period of the show. I tried to imagine what that was like, and what it's like for John, who, speaks openly about being gay, but what it's like to be in an environment in which it's not okay to be who you are, and what it's like. And especially what was interesting about the 1970s was, during this time, outing people was a way to bring down your political opponents. So there had to have been a fear for Phyllis that her son would be outed in order to hurt her. So that sort of really was underlying a lot of that storyline. Like, there's this fear in the 70s that this is a way that your opponents will bring you down.
So am I correct in that this is the first show that you're working on as a showrunner?
That's right.
So I'm curious, what was you've worked as a writer and producer on a number of shows, including Mad Men and Eli Stone. But what was the biggest challenge that you'd experienced in taking on the role of being a showrunner for the first time?
Well, everyone tells you it's an impossible job for one person to do well or to do it all. And, I remember thinking, I'm very organized, like I'll be fine. But it really is true. It's an impossible job for one person to do well. And the sooner you surrender to that fact that it is an impossible job for one person, I think the better off you are. And if you fight it, there's just that road leads nowhere good. I think the biggest surprise was, as a writer, what I love doing is writing and creating and being creative. And as a showrunner, there's so many more, there's so much managing you have to do and so many things you have to do that aren't creative. And that takes up so much of your time. And it really drains the part of your brain that needs to be creative. So balancing, that was such a balancing act that I sort of surprised me. When you're writing on a staff, all you have to do is be in the writer's room, write your draft, then you're on set. You can be really singularly focused. As a showrunner, you're doing 1,000 things at once, making 1,000 decisions a day and having to put out a million fires. And so finding the space to continue to be creative, I thought was one of the biggest challenges.
So one of the things that I think it's always interesting with a program like this that that is based on real life events and real people is sometimes you, in order to tell the story, you have to either create a fictional character or do a composite. And I'm wondering, were any of the major characters in the show portrayed either fictional or composite characters? And if so, why did you choose to use characters in that manner?
You're absolutely right. Whenever you're doing a true story, and you need to create these composite characters that are usually inspired by several different people, or we had such a big ensemble and we wanted to be able to, you can't have so many characters. So you want to collapse several characters into one. We had two composite characters on the show, one played by Sarah Paulson, Alice McRae, and the other one played by Kaylee Carter, Pamela Whelan. And the reason I wanted to create these composite characters was there weren't a lot of public figures within the Stop the IRA movement other than Phyllis Schlafly and Rosemary Thompson, who's played by Melanie Linsky, and Lottie Beth Hobbs, who's played by Cindy Drummond. The other women really aren't public figures. You can't really use their names. You can't really portray them because they're not public figures. But I still wanted to have other characters on her side and really particularly wanted to represent housewives, because those were the foot soldiers in her movement, were these everyday housewives who became political activists. So by creating these composite characters who are based on real people, I spoke to several women who were in the Stop the IRA movement. It allowed us to sort of represent these women in the series. I think without them, there would have been a real hole to the storytelling.
So I'm curious, we know we just talked about, fictional and composite characters. On the other side of that, were there any other figures from that time period that you wished you could have included in the series, but for one reason or another weren't able to?
That's a great question. Because the series is focused on the Equal Rights Amendment battle, it's not a series about the women's movement. We had to focus on the people who were involved in that battle, and that meant leaving out some great figures in history. Kate Millett. I wish we'd been able to do even more with Flo Kennedy, give her own episode. The radical feminists like the Red Stockings, who were from the late 60s, and then there were some Black feminists who were incredible, who we wanted to include, but weren't part of the Equal Rights Amendment battle. So my hope is that this series will inspire writers everywhere to write movies and TV series about all the women that we couldn't fit into the show.
You were actually telling me before we started that there was a scene that you wanted to put in there with one of the colorful characters from that time, Alabama Governor George Wallace, and Shirley Chisholm. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So in researching Shirley Chisholm's run for president, which is the subject of episode 3, we came across this incredible story. George Wallace, who was the Alabama governor at the time and running for president, was shot. And Shirley visited him in the hospital and got a lot of criticism and flack for doing so. But she said, we're in the same club. We're running for president. It could have been me. and I feel a duty to visit him in the hospital. And we actually, for a long time, we had a scene in the episode of her, and we even shot the scene of her visiting George Wallace in the hospital and what that was like. Unfortunately, we had to cut it for time, and you can't always, you have to kill your darling sometimes to get to a tight 50-minute episode. But I just thought it spoke to how she really marched to the beat of her own drum and was really a maverick. She just followed her gut, and, damn everyone and damn the critics, and it didn't matter to her what anyone thought of what she did. She did what was in her heart and followed her own intuition. And that was such an interesting example of that.
So, I mean, we were also talking beforehand about how, and this is brought up at the end of the series, that even though during the ratification process, the ERA fell 3 states short, we've seen this recent reigniting of the fight to ratify it. Illinois ratified it after being Phyllis Schlafly's home state for so long, and then Nevada did, and now Virginia has become the 38th Amendment, or the 38th state, or Commonwealth as we call it, to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. What do you think has been the spark that reignited the fight to ratify it?
First of all, we were so thrilled in the writers' room when the ERA had a resurgence in politics, because we spent so much time talking about how are we going to get audiences to even understand the ratification process. It's so complicated. It's so wonky. So as writers, we were just thrilled that it came through right in time for our show to come out. My guess is it was the 2016 election. I think the 2016 election really reignited the women's movement, as we saw with the Women's March in Washington. And I think there was suddenly this grassroots activism that had been dormant to some extent for 40 years to really push the Equal Rights Amendment. It really surprised me. I didn't expect something from so long ago to come back into the fray. Now, of course, because there was a deadline put on the Equal Rights Amendment, there's still a few hoops for it to go through, for it to actually make it into the Constitution. And there's a lot of debate on both sides about whether the Equal Rights Amendment would really is the fix, or if there's some other way for women to have equality. But for myself, it was very exciting. It made this series feel even more relevant. And it just shows you, nothing's ever dead. You just never know.
Just ask the career of Donald Trump. I'll get into it. Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us, Dahvi.
Thank you so much, Charles.
All the best during this Emmy season, and to all our viewers, please make sure to like this video, click subscribe, and to see our most up-to-date content, and go to goldderby.com to make your predictions and see.